people are still slowly filing in, but might as well start. And if unfortunately we're a little bit smaller this time because of unprecedented storms in the Northeast, then that's just a sign of the times. I did want to, I figure this is the right crew. Wish everyone a very happy August 4th. Today is the day that Skynet went live in 1997. Yep. No? All right. Rough crowd. So stay low, and if you work for an evil company, please stop doing what you're doing. We know how this ends. Mitchell, I did not get the questions that you sent. Did you send me recently, Mitchell?
I sent email to.
Oh, you did.
Told me. Okay.
After 7, yeah. Okay,
Sorry.
Good. A great way to get questions to me is emailing me. Thank you. Sorry, I hadn't looked at my phone since the beginning of bedtime. That's not true. I read off of the phone, but not emails. Anyway, hi, welcome to tonight's installment. We are very fortunate to have with us Chaim Singer of FlatIron and Abe Weiser of Splash. We're both recruitment managers. We'll have a presentation, an armchair conversation, things that you'd like to know. This is, in fact, a byproduct of the feedback that you're giving. So people wanted to hear more about the the recruiting process and hiring and about pivoting. So we have these fine gentlemen with us. As I mentioned at the end of the talk last week, I want to plug that Rafael Huseman is giving a talk on tech for non-techies, things that business owners, business leaders, decision makers need to know, a 3-part series, which is a great way, a great thing to share with a coworker who doesn't understand what you do, or with a boss, or with a client or a colleague. All of it will be perceived as, or a friend that you haven't been in touch with for a while, all of it will be perceived as you creating value in such a person's life, which was also a component of Rafael's talk last week. I will plug, this is selfish, for those of you who don't mind turning your video on, it is a little bit easier for the presenters to see who they're talking to. If you're eating or embarrassed, I understand, but if you feel comfortable turning your video on, it looks a little less empty here, and it's getting nice and crowded. So I'll plug the link to Rafael's talk, and Splash, not representing Splash, would like to actually kick off with a Dvar Torah before the presentation.
Hey, cool. I was given a heads up about this Dvar Torah maybe 2 minutes ago, so bear with me. This past Parsha, we had Shema in there. And in there it says, so right, you have to love Hashem with all of your soul. And then the question is, what does meodecha mean? So Rashi actually gives 2 pshat, which is actually pretty interesting. The first pshat Rashi says is that we're looking at an ascending order of what's beyond nafshecha, of giving up your soul for Hashem. What would be even more difficult to give up your soul for Hashem? And he suggests maybe it's your material possessions. And so Rashi has a little bit of back and forth saying, is this really true? Is it really possible that giving up your soul, right, giving up your life for Hashem, is it really harder to give up your material possessions for Hashem? And so he goes and he finalizes on the idea that says, yes, it is true that it's possible that there are select few that really could be very attached to their personal material items, and that they really would have much more difficulty of giving up your life for Hashem. But then there's the second shot that actually seems really interesting to me, is that the Chol Meodecha really means your lot in life, right? What Hashem gave you. And so what's really interesting about that is that Rashi goes straight into the idea is that B'chol me'odecha, accepting your lot in life with be'ava, with love. And what's interesting is that Rashi doesn't have the back and forth. Hey, is this really harder than B'chol nafshecha, right? Giving up your life for Hashem. That really B'chol me'odecha is accepting your lot in life. Is that really much more difficult? And the answer really is, and it's similar to the previous approaches. And just to give you some background, I have a little bit of a Chaim learning approach. So I guess this is how they all work. Could it be? And the answer is yes. that it's much harder in life to really accept bi'ava, that whatever Hashem has dealt you, the cards that you have received from Hashem, is really your lot in life, and really accepting that bi'ava, even if it's a difficult life, even if you're going through tsaros, and it's just understanding and accepting that point, that at that point, it would be easier to be dead, in a certain sense, to give up your life for Hashem, than accepting your lot in life. And so it's a really big insight and meaningful way to understand, is that in terms of the personal character of a person, of that it's easier, in a sense, to give up your life for Hashem, al Kiddush Hashem, as opposed to be'ava, thanking Hashem regardless of whatever cards you've been dealt, and really making that as part of your day-to-day, and thanking Hashem regardless of the situation that you're in. Which I actually think kind of ties into job searching and all that kind of stuff. So happy to have Chaim kick us off with the presentation. But in the end of the day, we're all here, you know, Avad Hashem's, and being thankful for what we've been dealt in life.
Awesome. Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Great. I just touched one thing and I completely lost my speaker notes. Just give me 1 second here. I apologize. All right, I'm just gonna have to do this one more time. Can people see the slides? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, my computer is being a little funky. All right, so really excited to be speaking with everyone today. To give some context, Abe and I are both recruiters. We used to work together a few years ago, particularly working in high-tech companies. I guess, you know, kind of the agenda of what we're hoping to go over and hopefully will be useful for people today would be, okay, it says my screen is no longer sharing. Are people sure that it's sharing?
Yeah, I still see it.
Okay, awesome. If you can see it, even I can't see it, but if you can see the slides, great. So I think we'll talk a little bit about how to go about finding a job in tech. I think that's actually a little bit of an underrated skill with everything, with job searching being basically entirely online these days. I think it can actually be a little bit complicated to know what you're looking for, and hopefully can share some decent tips in that regard. Talk a little bit about some just general tips for resumes. I think obviously at different stages of careers and in different industries, there are, you know, specific things that are going to be different types of resumes. But hopefully we'll be able to go over some ideas that are pretty generalizable for most people here. We'll talk a little bit about just some, you know, interview tips, about just generally how to interview, and then we'll jump into Q&A afterwards, so we can break out from what I understand. So quick background about us. So I've been a recruiter now for probably about 6 years.
Wait, Chaim, just to pause you, maybe I'll share the screen. How about that?
That works fine for me.
Okay, just give me a second. It seems like we've kind of frozen.
Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, 1 second.
If Bezos could have tech issues at a Senate hearing, you guys are good, don't worry.
Exactly. Okay. So here we go. Next slide, Chaim.
Yeah, please.
There you go.
So I've been in recruitment for about 6 years right now. Coming out of, I think back up before that, spent, you know, quite a few years in yeshiva after high school, didn't really know what I wanted to do with myself. Got into a field called industrial and organizational psychology, which is based around the science of how to do quite a few different things in the human resources, people operations space, including talent acquisition. Eventually moved into recruitment in what's called an agency, which is essentially an external third-party company that does recruiting for different companies that don't have capacity to recruit internally or are looking for support at growing fairly rapidly. In that time, I primarily worked with financial services companies, so places like Goldman Sachs, Bloomberg, Morgan Stanley, JPMC, but also got to work with some tech companies like Amazon, as well as, you know, TripAdvisor, DraftKings, things like that. and no matter what company I was working for, is really all focused on hiring either software engineers or infrastructure engineers. A lot of work on network engineering. After spending a couple years there, I moved in-house as the only tech recruiter at a nonprofit called the Simons Foundation. And after spending a couple years doing that, I moved on to FlatIron Health, which is a company that builds technology really to help doctors and researchers in the cancer space primarily. So all told, I've kind of worn a few different hats over that time, but I recently did a short calculation. I've probably seen somewhere in the ballpark of 50,000 resumes and LinkedIn profiles over the past 5 or 6 years. So having gone through a lot of different elements of the recruiting process, hopefully I'll have some useful tips to share with everyone. Abe, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Chaim and I we both started off at the same place at the beginning, working at an external agency, recruiting for really top tech companies. Ironically, FlatIron was a client of ours, and I actually jumped to, after that, I jumped to one of our clients as well at Cadre. Cadre was a financial real estate tech company. There I got the opportunity to really move more in-house recruitment, where I kind of see behind the curtain what's going on, scaled up a hiring team, hired a ton of engineers from similar backgrounds from Amazon, Google, Facebook, all those fun places. From there, I actually followed my manager from Cadre to Splash, where Splash I'm now currently leading all recruiting efforts. In the past year, we hired roughly 70 people between tech and non-tech. So kind of shifted my focus or expanded my focus on top of not just only technology, but non-tech roles as well. And I'm excited to give you guys a peek behind the curtain of how recruiting works, and then maybe we could be able to give you some insights to help make your career search, job search a little bit easier.
Awesome. So hopping into, I guess, how to find a job. So I guess first thing I should say, I think both of our point of views are focused probably a little bit more on corporate America. I don't know if all the advice that we have would be good, for example, if you're looking to get a job at a place like B&H or Centers or Meridian, something like that. I think this is much more for kind of our point of view, again, has been a lot with kind of small to large tech companies, primarily based here in New York. So I guess kind of first thought is applying directly. In my opinion, this is the best way, the best option of how to actually get your resume seen by a real human. While looking at jobs, really I think the place to start off with is thinking to yourself, what sort of companies am I interested in applying to? And going directly to those companies' websites and seeing what positions they have posted. Because the truth is, if a position, if they don't have a position posted on their website that aligns with your experience, there's a very, very small chance that your resume is going to get viewed on, even if you apply to them through some third-party agency or through some other job board. I also think it's really important to go directly to companies' websites, because that's where you're going to learn about what that company does, how to best tailor your resume for that specific company. I think and I think it's just the best way to make, a good first impression, right? And really that's what all a resume is. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. I guess one common myth I want to dispel, I know a lot of people are kind of worried about loading up their resumes with keywords and things like that. They think that resumes get reviewed by machine learning and stuff like that. Unless a company has 20,000 people, that's very uncommon. I could tell you every single resume that gets sent to where I work right now at FlatIron, and it's upwards of 5 to 10K a year. Every single one of those resumes gets reviewed by an actual human, probably the first 3 or 4 times that it gets sent in. Maybe after that, people might not be looking at it anymore. But I think that's really good news for everyone here, right? That if you kind of make the right impression, it's going to get seen by someone who understands what that company's needs are, and probably has a decent understanding of what your background is based off of what's going to be on your resume. So I think before applying, something important is think a little bit about what you're looking for, the type of job, the key responsibilities. In tech, being specifically thinking about technologies and terminologies. I think a good example of being cognizant of terminologies is like the title analyst, for example. So there might be a lot of people here who have backgrounds in SQL or R or Python, and they consider themselves analysts in some way, shape, or form. Be cognizant, like when you're applying to financial institutions, very often the term analyst has nothing to do with analysis, but is actually denoting a specific level within the career trajectory at a big investment bank or something like that. So definitely do your research before applying to places. I would say take your time. If you're really interested in a place, probably don't make it the first place you apply to. Take some time to interview at other places, get used to what the interview process looks like. Be cognizant of what the level of a job looks like. If there are people here coming straight out of college, there's a lot of, I guess, kind of weird cadences to when different companies hire. Campus is what's often called internally. So for example, applying this time of year, at most companies, you're not going to see jobs for entry-level professionals. And be cognizant that if you do apply to a senior level role, there's probably a pretty high chance that your resume is not going to be considered at that time. But again, thinking about the right sort of time and thinking about what sort of companies hire people coming directly out of school is probably pretty important. And also think about the type of company that you're looking at. I think in terms of both domain as well as size and scope of the company, that really informs, I think, how you should be presenting yourself to that sort of organization. Whether it's a more chilled sort of tech company, a more formal sort of financial institution, there are a lot of different ways that you can tweak how you present yourself through your resume and the way that you interview. I think a piece of advice, don't over apply to one company. I'd say some companies like Google, if you go to the careers page, will actually explicitly say, please, find 2 or 3 jobs to apply to, and that's it. I think that internally, every time you apply at any normal company that has an applicant tracking system, they will see every other time that you've applied in the past. And if they see you've already applied 10 times, it could be a little bit of a mark against you. So, be cognizant of that. And sometimes, unfortunately, you have to be patient. And sometimes there's just not going to be the right role at a company, even if it's really exciting. A piece of advice I give people is to keep track of where you've applied in the past. I think it's important for 2 reasons. First off, you can just kind of look at pass-through rates and do some calculations about, okay, what percentage of jobs do I apply to? Do I get a first-round interview? What percentage of those do I get to final round interviews? But I think also from a self-esteem standpoint, it could be really difficult, especially I think early career, it could be a little bit difficult in terms of, self-esteem sometimes. And you can see that you're actually making a lot of progress if you track every single place that you apply to. Just looking at a quick note here on the side. What about applying to the same company for different roles? Even then, I would still limit it to an extent. I think it's okay to apply to a couple of different roles, but also I'll give you an example. If you look at FlatIron's website where I work right now, you'll see jobs posted for platform engineer, full stack engineer, software engineer, staff software engineer. If you apply to all of those are all going to the same place internally. I'm reviewing every single one of those under the same bucket. So I would say, and that's probably not the case, for example, if you're applying to Google and you're applying to software engineer working on Maps, software engineer working on Google Cloud, software engineer working on a different Google product. So I think it depends the size of the company. I would say if they're different, I'd say, yeah, you could probably apply to 2 or 3 places if they're 2 or 3 times to one company, if they're significantly different roles. But if they're pretty similar, probably limit it just to 1 or 2. I guess kind of one other piece of advice, I don't know if there are a lot of people here coming out of apprenticeship programs or boot camps. Probably something to consider when looking for your first role is actually to look at internships, or to look specifically for this title apprenticeship, which I think is being used more and more for tech companies that are looking to find people with non-traditional backgrounds, people who don't necessarily have the college degree in some form of technology. So moving on to applying directly, right? Sometimes some companies that are really interesting you've never heard of in the past, right? And probably the best way to find out about them is going to be a third-party job board. I think the main function of a job board is to learn about companies or opportunities that you haven't heard of, because you've heard of Google and Facebook or other companies like that you might be interested in, and to go directly to their job board. I think when it comes to job boards, LinkedIn is really the gold standard. It's going to be the most powerful tool that's used by most recruiting companies. So you're going to have the most diversity of roles there, although definitely beware, we'll talk about in a second, that a lot of jobs on LinkedIn and any other job board are not actually posted by the company that the job is with. You have a lot of third-party agencies out there. I'd say in addition to LinkedIn, some places to look at would include Glassdoor, specifically in New York, built in NYC, I think is pretty solid for tech jobs. If people are working more in the infrastructure space, perhaps Dice. And I would say those are probably the main places I would consider. If people really want to work in nonprofits, there is a job board called Idealist that is worth looking at. And I'd say those are, and actually now I think increasingly probably Google Careers as well. I don't know if you pay to post with them or if they just aggregate off of other sites, kind of the way Indeed does, but they're probably a good place to look at as well. So talking about recruiting agencies, I think this is a way for people to find jobs primarily who are a little bit later in their careers. To give you an idea, again, as someone who used to work in a recruiting agency, essentially the way recruiting agencies function is imagine a company that's either very small, so they don't have an internal HR department, or they need to scale up at a very large rate. So they'll pay people externally to find them, talent. Generally speaking, no one is going to pay someone to get a resume unless that resume has a fair amount of experience. I can't think of any company that I know of that's used recruiting agencies for people with probably less than a year or two of experience. So again, I would say this is generally something for experienced hires, less so for junior hires. I think there's pros and cons to agencies for quite a few reasons. And we can talk a little bit more about that. And then the fourth thing, which I would actually say is probably the thing I know the least about, is networking. And I think it's something that can be really successful for a lot of people. I've never been the sort of guy who's been great at it. It won't necessarily get you very far in most corporate environments, to be honest. I think, networking, an example being if you connect with someone in my company, they will show me the resume. If you're right for the job, you're going to be right for the job. It might get you, an intro call or, a ticket to a first round interview, but it's not necessarily a gold ticket or anything like that. So I think those are the primary ways I would talk about kind of going about looking for a tech job. And again, to reiterate, do your best to keep track of where you've applied. Abe, you want to move on to the next slide? All right.
Yeah.
Resume.
There we go.
So I guess just a few brief notes on resumes. So recruiters, especially at more established companies, you see a lot of resumes. Every morning, I probably have somewhere in the ballpark of 10 to 50 resumes to go through. And after several years of that, recruiters can become really jaded and they take not a lot of time to look at resumes. And what that means is I think you have to do your best to make whatever makes you stand out at the top half of your first page and make it really evident. Because if not, it's going to get skipped over. So I think kind of, piece of advice number one, anyone with under 5 years of experience, there's no reason your resume needs to be over 1 page long. It doesn't need to say every great accomplishment that you've had or every amazing thing that you've done in your job. That's something that you're actually going to do during your interview process. I think what your resume, does need to do is talk about what your key pitch is. What is it that you're bringing to the table? Anyone with over 5 years of experience, I'd say 2 years. I mean, keep it to 2 pages. Still max, pretty much, unless you're looking at jobs in academia. I don't know if there are people here who have a lot of research publications, things like that. Those are one of the few places that I'd say exceptions for keeping things short. And I think, again, this is almost like a tell that people who look at a lot of resumes, you'll notice certain trends. People who have very, very long resumes are often people who they're not born in America. There are people who maybe have slightly antiquated perspectives about the job market. People who've been around for a long time. So I definitely think keeping it short and sweet is a good place to start off. So keeping your pitch at the top half of the page. So what is your pitch? This is going to be a little bit different for everyone. I'm not talking about like a summary of a mission statement that a lot of people have up there, unless I would say you're switching functions. So for example, if you're a software engineer looking to get into network engineering, that is a great thing to have on as kind of introductory sentence, to explain, hey, someone looking to shift from software to infrastructure or vice versa, or some other sort of shifts like that. I think really, your pitch can be different depending who you are, what stage of your career you are. So thinking about myself, for example, coming out of school, really, I was someone who had a master's degree, which is something that a lot of people coming out of college don't have. But my most impressive thing other than that was being a mashgiach. It wasn't something that was going to get me very far. So my education was right at the top of my resume. Now I'm a little bit further into my career, and frankly, Fairleigh Dickinson probably isn't the biggest seller in the high-tech world. So that goes way down to the bottom of my resume. And FlatIron Health, the company that I work for, that I think is a little bit better recognized in the high-tech industry, is something that is at the top of the resume. For different people, I think your pitch could be your certifications, it could be your last job, it could be tools or technologies that you've worked with. Really try to think about what is your value add that's going to bring you into a company, and do your best to make sure that it's very clear and easy to read at the top of your resume in some way, shape, or form. Something that's a little bit harder for me to talk about because I don't have an experience in design, but kind of I know it when I see it, is having a cleanly formatted resume, making it easy that whatever information you put on there is really easy to digest quickly. I would suggest, unless you're a UX designer and you really know what you're doing, 1 or 2 colors max. Really black and white is totally fine. I know people like to make really sticky resumes. It doesn't, unless they're applying to something that requires an eye for design, it doesn't really help that often. I think kind of similarly about kind of the 2-column resumes, not always the best, thing to do, because again, it could actually take up a lot of the valuable room. When you're having only 1 or 2 pages, those extra margins make it harder to put information in there. I would think a lot of people would talk about maybe using a sans serif font as something that makes your resume look perhaps a little bit modern. I'd be cautious about, bolding and underlining and italicizing things to make things more visible. And just generally should be consistent in how you present things. So if your top job, then you have it in a format of your role name and then the company name and then how many years you were there. You have to do it in that exact same way for every other job. People sometimes don't do that. And the resume starts to get a little bit sloppy when people are trying to figure out, 1 second, so what did they do from 2015 to 2017, because things are formatted differently in different parts of the resume. I would say I don't think people really need to have location for every single job that they've been at. That's something you see in a lot of resumes, and it just takes up a lot of space and makes things, again, a little bit harder for the eyes to process quickly. And kind of similarly, I think when you're dealing with positions that are probably over 10 years ago, you don't need to have a lot of details on those jobs. And in some cases, I would even say it probably works against you in some cases to have a lot of that information, because unfortunately in the tech industry, there's definitely a problem with ageism, where people have biases against people who are, overly experienced and might be, considered to be, not modern with, specific technologies or things like that. It doesn't need to have every tool that you've ever used. It's I guess, pretty presumed that you've worked with, if you're saying, I guess, that, you've worked with, React, you don't necessarily need to put JavaScript too. Like people will assume that, as an example. Someone's asking about references. I would not do that personally. I think, if you want to, you can write references available upon request at the bottom of your resume. I don't think it's a big add. Some companies never ask for for references. The company that I work for will ask for references for every single person, but only all the way at the end of the process. So I don't know if having references add too much to a resume that will make most hiring managers or recruiters go, oh, we should move this person forward. That being said, I think there might be some notable exceptions. So for example, if your reference is a well-known tech person, or potentially a CTO of a mid-sized company or larger company, then perhaps having a name on there could do it. But if it's just Yenin, who is only an important person to you, I would say keep that in your back pocket. You can let your recruiter know at some point in the process you have references available, but I don't think it's going to be a value add. So cover letters. Should you have a cover letter? Abe, what do you think? Should you have a cover letter?
The big no.
I would say in most cases they're not necessary. I would think for me the exception is, again, if there's like a quick sell in there that you're not going to be able to fit into your resume. For me, the only thing I look on for a cover letter is to see if the person actually has an idea about what the company I work for does. So again, I work for a company that hopefully is trying to make the world a little bit of a better place by providing tools to doctors and researchers in the oncology space to help people with cancer. If you send a cover letter and you don't reference that you care about the mission, you don't care about making the world a better place, it kind of makes me wonder, like, how did your resume end up in my inbox? So again, I don't think it's strongly necessary. And if you do have a cover letter, keep it short, 1 or 2 paragraphs. You want to leave things to discuss on your interview, because if you say everything good about yourself in your resume in your cover letter, people are going to be looking for juicier stories when it comes to the interview itself, and you're not necessarily going to have something to say about that.
Cool. Love to jump in there as well on cover letters. Oftentimes, if you get a little too verbose on your resume or on your cover letters, those usually count against you. So the idea and the way that I would look at viewing your resume is that you have to have the needed experience in order to get the interview. The resume doesn't get you the job, it gets you the interview, and then the rest is up to you. So basically, from a recruiter's perspective, as Chaim said, keep it short. I'm looking for, let's say, someone that has 4 years of experience working on front-end technologies. So I look at the first job. I see someone saying, what do you think about a summary? I personally would skip it, because basically as a recruiter, I go straight towards your experience and saying, do you fit that role? I'm not necessarily reading a paragraph about your interests or, your whole career progression. I want to be able to see that through your resume. So ideally, if I'm looking at your resume and I'm looking for a senior software engineer or senior front-end engineer, ideally that would be first thing on your resume, right? It's your name, your address, and then it'd say senior front-end engineer, X company, starting from this date. Because there's usually these bare minimum requirements that we're looking for in order to check off the box to make sure that it's worthwhile continuing the process with the candidate. So for example, if I'm looking for someone with at least 4 years of experience, I want to be able to see that quickly. I don't want to have to piece together, trying to figure out when was your start dates and all that kind of stuff. Ideally, put the month that you started. It doesn't have to be a specific date, and then the year that you started. So I'd be able to be like, okay, you started in 2017, and they have 3 years of experience. So they senior front-end engineer. There we go. Do they have front-end technologies on their current experience? Awesome. I think that's a person that's worthwhile to speak to. If, for example, your current experience doesn't hit that 3-year mark, then I'd go back maybe to your previous job before that. But basically, it's your first job and your most current job that really speaks the most about what you're looking for. And then on top of that, I would suggest people to edit their resumes based off of the job that they're going for. So for example, make sure that you have the information that what people are looking for on your resume at the front, as Chaim said. So if you're looking for a front-end engineer, say it as clear as possible. I'm a senior front-end engineer. Whereas if you, hello? All right, cool. And then if, for example, you're looking for just a senior full stack role, right? Just write that as your title, what what you are, as long as you could speak towards it and towards your experience. And then in terms of clean formatting, as I said before, just make it as clear as possible. The years of experience you have, right? So how long were you at this previous company, and what the company that you're working at. Now, some few examples I want to point out. For example, we had someone that we actually hired coming from Israel, actually at Cadre. So he applied twice to the job that we were recruiting for. The first job, it just gave his experience, but I said, I saw he was located in Israel, and I was like, we're not hiring for people outside of New York. Then the next time I saw his resume, it said moving from Israel to New York this month. And so at that point, then they had the required experience and the information that I was looking for. And then I spoke with them, and it ended up being a hire for the company. So it's really important that you want to answer your questions or any gaping questions that people would have right when they look at your resume. So for example, if you're applying for a job out of the States, out of the, New York, and you want to move somewhere else, put that up there, like seeking to move outside of New York. Oftentimes that can become a barrier. Or if you're looking for remote work or whatever it is, just make sure that information is as clear as possible.
I would add, for people who have names like Chaim or like very non-American names, consider having U.S. citizen at the bottom of your resume. Or if you have a lot of experience coming from a foreign country, but you went to high school in America, stick that in there so people understand, like, oh, this person's like English as a first language native. There's little tricks like that that would be relevant for some people.
Yeah, no, definitely. Cool. So we'll go to the next slide. Chaim.
Well, I guess I'm handing over to you. Yeah, interviewing. I think interviewing, it's interesting. I think this is really the part where you get to prove yourself. Unfortunately, there's so many barriers of entry to get to the interview. And once you get to an interview, it's just such a nerve-wracking experience, unfortunately, for a lot of people. Interviews are in no way, shape, or form scientifically the best way to determine if people are great for a job. But it's the best that we can do, to quote Winston Churchill. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of tips when it comes to interviews are a little bit common sense, but I guess a few things that are going to be unique to the tech industry we can go through. I don't know if I have much on the next slide about this, but.
All right, cool. Awesome. Yeah, so exactly. And so this will be my portion, is covering best tips and tricks for the interviews themselves. From my understanding, you had previous conversations about how to pass certain coding interviews, certain technical interviews. So we're going to be focusing more high level on how to get you through two different types of interviews. As we say, there are now behavioral interviews versus situational interviews. And then also, I'm really a big fan of creating a narrative. Okay, so first off, an interview is really there to show that you are able to do the job itself. I know it sounds pretty simple, but sometimes people go on tangents focusing on areas that have no relation to the job itself. So for example, if you're looking for a senior front-end engineer job, and then you were talking about how you really enjoyed a manual QA part of it, it doesn't exactly help your case in terms of getting the job and showing your ability to do the job itself. Now, throughout the interview process, as recruiters work with hiring managers to structure the interview process, there's oftentimes different skill sets or different areas that they're testing for throughout the interview process. And just to give you a sense, usually how it works, and at least it works at Splash, is that we sit down with the hiring manager and say, hey, what are we looking for this person to accomplish, right? Why do we need this job? Then we say, okay, So we're looking for someone to do X. What skill sets are they going to need in order to be successful in the role? And then we move on beyond that is that now how are we going to test against those skill sets to make sure that the person that we're speaking with will be successful in this role? So when you can get a sense of that through the job description or the way that you applied from, whereas you see the core requirements and stuff that they're looking for, as well as they do mention out, hey, this is the point of the job. It's really important to understand what they're looking for, because oftentimes that gives you a sense of the underlying question or where they're trying to get with the questions that they're asking you. Now, there are two types of interviews. I would call them behavioral and then situational questions. And then also technical questions, right? So behavioral questions is really how would you, I'm just this noise. But basically, between behavioral and situational questions are they want to see, do you have the demeanors or the tendencies to be able to be successful in the role? And then have you proven yourself in the past in specific situations to show that you're capable of doing the job? Now, oftentimes throughout a job, there are sometimes high-pressured situations. There's oftentimes, ambiguity. You don't know necessarily what's going on. And so the idea is that they want to be able to see, hey, how would you necessarily do in these situations? Now, they do understand interviewing could be an intense environment, an environment where it could trip people up. So they don't try to blatantly trick you, but the idea is that we want to get as much insight from you as possible. Now, the best way that I like going about these two different areas, right, behavioral and situational questions, is really by creating a narrative, right? You want the people that you're speaking with able to understand your career path and your decisions of what you've made and how you've gotten there. So really building up, right, hey, this is my decision out of school. I was looking for, personally, right, I was looking for an agency. I wanted a breadth of knowledge. I wanted to get to know.
I had them since 9 o'clock, putting them to bed, right?
And then basically from there, from creating a narrative, right, then you also want to show, hey, then I accomplished this at my job. These were the challenges that I was facing. Really constantly building up and saying like, hey, these are my specialties, right? If you're a senior front-end engineer, you're saying, no, I really was interested in front-end technology. I like the aspect that it's customer facing and it's interactive. And then you say, well, while I was at this company, I built this module and I was able to focus on this. Then as I continued to grow my career, I was able to mentor more junior people and able to scale my skill set and really prove beyond that, dealing with the overall architecture and design. You want to be able to show the layers that you've learned throughout your career of being able to prove your value to the company and how you really gained from your time at these companies, as opposed to just being a place clocking in 9 to 5, whereas you really took it as an opportunity to learn. So just to give you an example also, so when people are asking you situational questions, you're able to say now from that conversation, right, hey, at my previous job where I was explaining to you how I was able to build out this specific feature that really meant a lot to me, these are certain challenges that we had to face, and these are how we got around them. I also like to do that even for behavioral questions, right? Behavioral questions. So basically, if someone trying to understand you from a more behavioral space, as long as you could point back to the story and the narrative that you're creating, it really goes a long way on showing the interviewers that I'm experienced, I've done this in the past, I've seen these problems and I figured out how to solve for them, and I've been successful doing so, right? Sometimes you might not have an answer for everything, but ideally you want to be able to point to your previous experiences to prove that you've already done it before. Theoreticals, right, just talking about, I would theoretically do this, I've never had experience with this, so I think I would do that, doesn't give the interviewers a bit of confidence of your ability to do the job itself. So really being able to point back to your previous experiences and how you would be an asset to the company.
I want to add on that. A really great thing about talking about past experience is that you don't need to think about that on the spot. If you have an interview coming up in a week, you can take all the time you want to think about stories where you've done something important for your company or something that was important for your team. And you can think about how to contextualize what were the challenges in those cases and how you overcame those challenges. That's absolutely not something I think you should be thinking about the day of the interview. I think, yeah, I mean, and again, it really goes into the part of creating a narrative, right? Trying to figure out how do you get what could be a pretty complicated situation down into maybe a 3-minute spiel, and then, allow them to ask probing questions about that story.
Very cool. Awesome. I think this is the end of the slides. Love to open this up for a quick Q&A. Happy to answer any questions anyone has about how people come to their decision, how companies make the final decision of who to choose, a lot of internal processes, negotiating offers, which I do believe is actually a big part of the process as well. Oftentimes I do feel like that people do leave money on the table, but you have to understand the position that you're coming from. Happy to answer really any questions or anything like that. So I'd like to open it up to everyone. And I'll stop sharing my slides. Very cool. Anyone want
So I have a couple questions. If someone wants to ask like from themselves, but I'll kick off questions with ones that I received. One is, when looking for an entry-level dev position, when looking for an entry-level dev, do you consider the applicant's potential management skills, or do you just care about someone who can perform on his or her level now?
I'm happy to start off with this if Chaim wants to add as well. An entry-level dev. So basically, we have a career laddering within, most companies have a career laddering of what you're looking for in each position and leveling. Entry level, we are looking for people that are excited to learn and show the ability and aptitude to learn new skill sets. We don't expect you to be the most experienced person in the world, but having side projects, showing that you've shown interest in honing in your skills and looking to really grow with the company and really be able to contribute and understand that you're going to be in a position where it might be uncomfortable because you're going to be learning new skill sets that you haven't had to work on before. That's something that really goes a long way. Oftentimes, to be honest, when we were like even hiring interns at Cadre, for example, we kind of have a stronger focus on computer science fundamentals. Considering the fact that you're so close to coming out of school, asking those, classic data structures, algorithmic based questions, we expect you to have a stronger grasp on how those work, not necessarily to be an expert coder on being able to, knowing all the nuances of the language that you're using, but really being able to show your ability to learn and the knowledge that you've learned throughout college.
Yeah, I'll agree with everything Abe just said. And I'd say the word that I hear coming up a lot with entry-level people is coachable. Is someone receptive to feedback? If someone starts hinting something to you or interrupting you while you're interviewing, listen to what they say, because chances are that's an experienced engineer and they might want to see how you react to negative feedback or to push back on something. You want to see if you're someone who's going to be receptive to feedback. When it comes to management skills, to be honest, I think we expect by the time you're senior enough to be a manager, you're probably going to be on to your next company, right? That might be 5 or 10 years into your career. Tech has very high churn. So it's always great to see someone who has that sort of charisma and people skills, but at the entry level, it's more of like a frosting as opposed to like the cake itself, right?
So I'll take credit for that question. But yeah, is that something that you would want to see that I should put on a resume, or that was something that would distract or take away valuable real estate from my experience?
Like kind of like what we said before, it depends on the role that you're applying for. If this is an entry-level software engineering position, they're not looking for managers at all, to be honest. So that could most likely be detrimental. That being said, having on your resume that you were part of certain groups and you led those groups, and I know like a code group or some kind of society within college, that goes a long way. Showing stuff outside of the classroom really does go a long way. But that being said, we're usually 90% of the time, if you're entry level, what skill set are you bringing that you're going to be able to manage anyone? So that, to be honest, so basically you're not going to be a manager out the gate. Very few people become managers within the first 3 to 5 years of their experience. If they do, they must be really incredible, but they don't become managers without having really strong technical skill sets. And so in order to get buy-in from the team and stuff like that. So really focus on the technology aspects, focus on your skill sets and aptitude to learning. And again, yeah, agreeing with Chaim, coachability, really being able to work in different scenarios and situations. And then also one more thing to add there, from the coachability aspect, they ask you a question that you don't know. Don't just shut down. Speak through your thought process and the problem that you're trying to solve, because they're less trying to see how quick are you at answering a question within a certain time frame, as much as how good are you at problem solving and walking us through your thought process. So if you get stuck in an area that you don't know, you're like, well, I think this might be an approach because of this, right? And here are the the benefits, the cost benefit analysis of doing these steps. That goes a really long way, even on senior level engineers I've seen in the past. Whereas if someone doesn't solve the problem, but they clearly were on the right track because they were communicating the thought process they were going on, oftentimes that goes a long way and helps in your favor.
Yeah, I'd also be careful with how you word past managing experience. I was just thinking about a friend of mine who had worked, warehouse jobs, a little bit more high-ish jobs for a long time. I took a look at his resume, and one of his first bullet points was, I've managed 45 people, right? So a lot of us, if we see that, like, oh, you're trying to apply to corporate America for an entry-level position, you say you've managed 45 people, that's director level. Like no one can, like, move you to director level. So I kind of helped him, like, we're going to write this as you coordinated the work of 45 people, right? You coordinated the work. Because in reality, when it came to his management experience, it was telling blue-collar workers, what to punch in and what to do on a day-to-day basis. Very different than the sort of management skills that you might see in more corporate setting where you have formal performance reviews and you're responsible for hiring and firing in a very different sort of capacity than you would in a blue-collar setting. So I think there's ways to display those traits, but think about how to translate it into more of a tech world.
Awesome.
There was a hand raised earlier.
Mitchell had like 3 more questions. Do you want me to?
Over.
Just your favorite one.
I could read them off if you want. You don't have to.
I'd say we have time for one more question in this forum, and then we'll move to the next part of the event.
Okay, so let's go. Let's
I have one.
Here, I'll ask my favorite of Mitchell's questions. It's what, if any, are the downsides of highballing a salary request when asked by an interviewer or other HR?
Well, if you do it too early and you're like completely, and you do it in the wrong way, like you're going to leave a bad taste in the person's mouth. If they're going to be like, I don't want to work with you. Or if I am going to work with you, I'm going to be pretty strict on you, right? I should also say with entry level, a lot of places, like there is no flexibility. I'm fairly certain where I am, every entry level software engineer is getting paid the same exact thing. I don't think there's any sort of negotiation happening there. But I'd say later in the career, you should definitely shoot higher than what you're aiming for, because that's how negotiation works. But I think be reasonable. I think there's a lot of good as well as even more bad resources for finding out what engineers should be getting paid at different companies. One of the places I would tell you to look at something that's called H-1B data, which is actual information that the government puts out based off of, so in other words, it's what's called verified employee salary information as opposed to anecdotal self-reported data. And that will, again, tell you a little bit about what different companies will pay different engineers. It won't necessarily tell you how many years of experience they have or what tools or technologies they work in, but that's a good idea to learn only about cash-based salaries. Pretty much anything else you're going to see on the internet is going to be hearsay. So make friends with a recruiter or someone who works in compensation professionally. They can give you a pretty decent idea about things. But I would generally, I don't know, Abe, what would you say? I'd say shoot 10, 15% higher than what you're looking for. Anything above that, you'd be looking a little too cocky.
Yeah, and also keep in mind, so for example, if you're working in a larger organization, assume that the recruiter has spoken with multiple people from that company. So for example, during my time at Andiamo, I was able to get within like a 10K ballpark of what someone was earning at Microsoft, depending on their title and the years that they've been there. So the recruiters oftentimes are really, really good at pricing or seeing what is reasonable for someone to ask. And just to keep in mind, this is the beginning of your relationship with the recruiter. The recruiter is entirely incentivized to hire great talent to make their team successful, but also to make those hires in the end. So if I'm as a recruiter, dealing with someone and I feel like they're being extremely aggressive or unreasonable early on within the process, it's going to be harder for me to want to go and advocate for you at the final stages, knowing that it's going to be really difficult. That being said, do not feel uncomfortable pushing the barrier a little bit. It depends. Oftentimes larger companies have strict salary bands, sometimes smaller companies don't. So know the audience that you're speaking with. And then one more thing, just to, I guess, put that out there, feel free to turn it back on them. Ask them what's the range, the salary range for this role. Oftentimes they'll tell you the top of the range, 10K less than it really is. So just keep that in mind as well. So they usually try to set underwhelming expectations. So at the end of the stages where you would get an offer, ideally we would be able to then blow you away and make you very excited for the offers. Also, interview with multiple places. Oftentimes I run into candidates who are like, oh, I just want to check out one company at a time. That removes any leverage that you have with negotiations. So oftentimes you just talking about, hey, I'm actively interviewing. You don't have to rub it in their faces. You don't have to be, aggressive about it. But say, hey, I'm actively interviewing with other companies. There, you'll be able to, see what your market value is, right? If you're able to interview with multiple companies and then get offers from multiple companies, you'll be able to see if your ask is reasonable. Oftentimes people do leave money on the table when they are just doing one interview at a time and they're not, competing with another company. I'm sure Chaim and we could count multiple times where I usually like joking around is that oftentimes the engineers that get to the offer stage by us have 3 or 4 other offers in hand. And that's 90% the case. It's very rare where someone's not actively interviewing with multiple places. And I do think it's a good strategy from an interviewing perspective to be able to measure and negotiate against offers against each other. But do it in a way that it's like a partnership, right? You're not trying to demand anything from these people. You're not saying, hey, I'm worth this much, and you're being insulted if they offer you a little bit less. It's a partnership between you and the recruiter. The recruiter, they're entirely wanting to, give you as much money as possible that's reasonable. So just like say like, hey, I would love to join the company. It's just, the financially doesn't make sense or whatever it is. And oftentimes the recruiters will work with you and try to get you that extra money if it comes from, cash on the base salary, or if you're at a startup, some stock options or something like that. I do also rule of thumb, I would almost always ask for a 5K increase, regardless of where you go, just to see. Nobody's going to reject you necessarily because of you asking for a 5K increase. And worst case scenario, they just say no and you'll get your regular offer. But best case scenario, you get that extra 5K.
I'm just curious, like the number 5, I hear it, like it's just, why not 10? It doesn't work for 10?
Well, I mean, it matters. It just matters. 5, you have to also understand. So every $5,000, if you were working a job here in New York, it comes out to like $100 per paycheck, or even less, depending on the tax brackets you're in. So it's not a huge sum. The reason why I would say 5 is the idea is that after 3 or 4 job changes, if you constantly are asking for that 5K and you have the difference, you have $15,000 to $20,000 more in your pocket as part of your salary. 10K, I won't say you shouldn't ask for 10K more, but it really depends on the budgeting of the team and what sounds reasonable. Oftentimes when they come out with the offer, they're not leaving tons of money or budget on the table, and so 5K could usually be stretched. Right? You like, oh, we're maxed out the budget of X number of dollars, but we could stretch an extra 5K because we're really excited about the person. When it's 10K, it's a more significant sum usually, and finance usually gives you a little bit more pushback.
It also can create issues with internal equity much more commonly, right? So sometimes someone really does want to pay you more money, but the fact is that there's someone who's more senior than you on the team, and you're never going to get paid more than that person. 10K puts a good chance that you're going to start hitting other people's brackets, right? 5K, it's fairly negligible. And it might be that if they have to, this doesn't happen where I currently work, but last place I worked, it would happen. Like, okay, so if we're going to give this person 5K, that means we need to give this other person 2K. We can swing that. But if we give this person 10K, that means we have to give this other person 7K, or something like that. So.
These are all the fun secrets.
I also used to work in compensation. I like that field a lot.
Yeah, no, it's fun.
We hate compensation, so that's it.
Ari, I think I heard you starting to ask a question or something like that. Is there something that we haven't touched that I'm happy to answer any questions for you?
I was just going to ask if what sorts of behavioral questions do you typically ask to an entry-level person who doesn't necessarily have as much experience within the tech industry?
Yeah, no, great question. Oftentimes, just to give you a sense, companies or startups in general, what I've seen, Chaim, you could tell me if I'm wrong or correct, they have these what they call core values for the company, which is core values that they look for everyone in the company to exhibit. You could look on, almost every company that I've worked at, we've had our core values on our websites. So those are important areas to just look up. For us, for example, it's one of them is, you know, being real, right? You know, being down to earth, not, you know, beating around, you know, negative stuff and just saying, hey, these are the problems and this is how we're going to face it. So looking at the career website oftentimes has the company's core values, and then they're going to ask questions based off of that. So I would, before having an interview, prepare certain stories or answers about how you have had exhibited those core values in the past.
Yeah, I think with us, where I am right now, behavioral questions are pretty much always going to get down to interpersonal skills. They're going to come down to, tell me about a time you hit this conflict or this barrier and how did you get through it? Because that's something that's important in the way our company functions. So, and again, I think a good interviewer can make any story answer any behavioral interview question. If you just need to have 2 or 3 stories. And remember, by the way, you can say the same story to multiple people. I didn't know that for a while. Not every interviewer is comparing notes at every company, and no one ever says that's against the rules, right? Like if you have a good story and you say it 2 or 3 times because you're asked similar questions, there's nothing wrong with that. And kind of similarly at the end where they're like, do you have any questions for me? You don't need to have 3 unique questions for every person who's interviewing you. You could just say, I asked someone else about this, but I want to get another perspective. What's the day-to-day like? Or how do you do your daily stand-ups or whatever it is, you know?
Yeah. And also asking questions that show that your interest of long-term, like a long-term relationship with the company goes a long way as well, right? So trying to figure out the day-to-day, making sure that they understand that you're really interested in finding a place that you're going to be there for a while. As sometimes like we have engineers who maybe shut down, don't ask any questions, maybe are all about the money. And they feel like, oh, you know, we're just going to have someone leave within a year and a half after they join the company. So if you ask questions about career growth, career trajectory, all that kind of stuff goes a long way.